This conference will now be recorded.
Hello, we are at the April 12th, 2022 South Whitehall Township Planning Commission Comprehensive Plan Workshop. And we will start off with the Pledge of Allegiance. This meeting is being recorded, just in case. Pledge allegiance to the flag, United States of America, to the republic, stands one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, I think we'll go with a roll call and then the meeting rules.
Okay. Let me just read something first. These meetings are intended to be Planning Commission workshops. The goal of these workshops is to complete the Planning Commission's Pennsylvania Municipalities Planning Code duty to prepare the comprehensive plan for the development of the municipality as set forth in this Act, MPC, and to present it for the consideration of the governing body. While it is the role of the Planning Commission to prepare the comprehensive plan, to do so without the input of the Board of Commissioners would ultimately reduce the chances of the Board of Commissioners approving the comprehensive plan. Therefore, any input provided by Board of Commissioner members will be invaluable moving forward with the drafting of the comprehensive plan. Please note this is a hybrid in-person remote meeting. All participants are welcome to verbally give comment during the designated portions of the meeting. We'll now do a roll call. For the Planning Commission, Brian Height.
Here.
Diane Kelly.
Here.
Mark Luth. I do not see him in remote, so he is not present. Bill McNair.
Here.
Alan Tope.
Here.
David Wilson.
Here.
Now from the Board of Commissioners side, Monica Hodges.
Here.
Diane Kelly.
Here.
David Kennedy. I don't see him in the remote side, so he is not here. Brad Osborne.
Here.
Mike Walk. And once again, I don't see him on the remote side, so he is not here. Shall I go into the rules?
Oh, yeah, so we do have a quorum for whatever we need it for.
We have a quorum for Planning Commission, which is what we're here for.
Okay.
All right, these are the rules for remote participation and etiquette during Planning Commission meetings. For an orderly meeting wherein all attendees may be fully able to participate, we ask you to adhere to the following rules. Please mute your telephones and microphones to avoid background noise that may cause interference in the meeting and make it difficult for others to hear. Staff may mute the microphones of remote attendees if needed. Public questions and comments will be taken at periodic intervals throughout the agenda. We will start with no time limits, but the Planning Commission Chairman may impose a time limitation if there are many questions or if the meeting is running short on time. For in-person attendees, unfortunately we have none tonight, so I'll skip that. For remote attendees, the chat box feature will be active throughout the meeting. If you have a comment or question, please type your full name and address in the chat box, which is indicated by the speech balloon icon in the upper right of your screen. When you are recognized and so directed, please unmute your microphone and state your question or comment. Mute your microphone when done. For those who are accessing the meetings by phone only, staff will periodically ask for caller comments and unmute any callers. Callers must identify their name and address prior to making a comment. Your cooperation and adherence with these rules will ensure an orderly and respectful meeting. And for those of you in here tonight, this indicates that there is a chat box comment. So right now, it's off.
Oh, okay, so that's all. Okay, good.
Thank you.
All right, we will start with the agenda. That's agenda item 2. Agenda item 3 is approval of the meeting minutes from February 8, 2022. Are there any comments on those meeting minutes?
I do have one comment on page 1. The list of members showed Michael Wolk as Vice President of the Board of Commissioners. It's actually David Kennedy.
Okay. All right. Are there any other comments? Okay. I'll entertain a motion to approve as amended.
Motion to approve as amended?
Second? Second. Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay. Unanimous approval for the meeting minutes. All right. We will now move on to, well, agenda item 4, process review has been completed January 11th. And agenda item 5, comprehensive plan goals and implementation. The overall goals were completed on February 8th. And now we're going to move on to resource protection. Turn it over to you all.
So I'm happy we have, oh, excuse me. So I'm happy that we made it further than we did in the last meeting. So things are good so far. So the way we're working this is we have that statement of goals and objectives, and that's the overall. At that first meeting, we dug into that. We had a lot of comments, and then we as staff distilled all of that, kind of came up with new goals and objectives. Those are in the working outline in the document. In addition to, I just want to talk about some changes that were made to that working outline. As things come up and as we do work on specific items, we'll be putting them into that document. You'll notice that the demographic profile has been updated based on the 2020. I don't know if I forget if he got the ACS or the census data. So that reflects more current data than the existing conditions report. So the first graphic you see is the change from 2015 to 2020. And then the second one is the updated graphs from the existing conditions report. The big takeaway, and I think you'll notice it, is the median age dropped by 2 years in that 5 years, or almost 2 years. And then if you look at the chart on the second page, I apologize to those, I don't have it on in my presentation, so I can't really show anybody. But on the second page, because of that change in median age, we wanted to look back from 2000 and see where we were in 2000 and see what kind of trends we were seeing. So if you go to that second page, you can see we have a lower median age than we have since 2000. So that is a pretty significant change. We've done some speculation internally as staff, and we've seen, and in conversations with the school board, they've seen it as well, as some of the neighborhoods are turning over. So the people are getting older and moving out, and younger families are moving in, which is one of the great things, and especially when we get to housing, we'll talk about this, but South Whitehall has a pretty varied housing stock. So we have affordable with the lowercase a homes, so lower price point homes in some neighborhoods, which helps those young families move in. The other big contributing factor was the KRE apartments, 450 apartment dwellers. Typically apartment dwellers are younger, so that'll bring our median age down. So it's a significant change. We wanted to talk about it, and one of the things we'll do for the comp plan when we get to it is have call outs on specific things that are really important or things that happen that are significant. So we'll probably put in a call out that talks about this demographic shift that we're seeing at South Whitehall. I didn't want to spend a whole lot of time on that. I just want to kind of let you know that we've been working on different sections of the comp plan, and as we do it, we'll be filling them into this document. So as we have these meetings, we'll tell you what we've updated. As you're reviewing them, when you get the packets, feel free to shoot comments or questions related to that.
Thanks. So I can feel younger now.
Well, you count.
We knocked 2 years off your life. You're 2 years younger.
Actually, it's 4 years, isn't it?
4?
Yeah.
Oh,
See how
Four.
fast things change?
Yeah, just like that.
David, I had a question on the median age. If I look back to the graph from 2000 to 2020, it wasn't a decline. It actually climbed, kind of came down a little bit, back up a tiny bit. You know, it's not what I would have expected to see. So I just didn't know if there was any background where trends regionally have done the same thing.
So I haven't looked at the regional trends yet. But one of the things that we've seen regionally, and maybe Hannah can jump in, is when there's a housing boom in a township, typically that indicates younger families are moving in. And then you'll see that that group age in place. So that'll kind of show the aging rise. And then you start to see the turnover in residents. So, once the kids go to college, they move out, people downsize, move out of their house, and you start to see that turnover, which is kind of what we're seeing and what, our conversations with the school district have indicated as well. So it feels like it's kind of common, but I haven't compared it to anything at this point.
Thank you.
So let me just go back to, this is the overall agenda process. We have the statement of goals and objectives, and then the different sections. Once we get through those sections, we get into mapping and land use, and then plug things back into the model. And all of that will lead to the draft comprehensive plan. Individual meeting flow, any public comments we receive, we'll review them. We'll review the synthesized goals, objectives. So after we have our meeting, we as staff kind of put everything together, come back, present that to you. And the idea is we get buy-in. I wouldn't call it an approval, but buy-in, that we can post that on the website and have a form to collect public comment on that group of goals and objectives. So the next meeting, we should have more public comment to review as we kind of build this thing. So we've had was it Dan Spiegel? Don, I'm sorry, I forgot his last name. Was it Dan? Talked about the 309 corridor. So there was a very well written letter. And when we get to transportation, we'll certainly bring that up. That letter has prompted some conversations with PennDOT and the 309 Betterment Project. We've been in contact with them. So we're with the intent of making sure things are coordinated. We have land development coming in along 309. Want to make sure everybody's on the same page and talking to each other. One of the impetuses for reaching out to PennDOT on the 309 project. Rick Bronstein had the comment for the lands of Jarris. We saw their sketch plan 2 planning commission meetings ago. So that prompted comments and questions. We're working with them to set up a meeting with staff and a few commissioners, planning commission. Stay tuned, we'll figure that out. I think what we'll probably do is schedule the meeting and then figure out who can make it, as opposed to trying to synchronize all of it. But stay tuned, we're still kind of working through that. So this brings us to the review of the synthesized goals, objectives, and implementation. At the first meeting, we did prioritization exercises. So these numbers, of course, I don't have as neat graphs as Hannah provided with the Mentimeter, which you'll see those later. So we just wrote them down. So if you look at the working document, those numbers will correspond with the goal. So GP2 and 3 were the top ones. CP1. So what we did is we took these prioritizations and all of the comments. And as staff, 3 of us had a working lunch and kind of were throwing stuff on the wall, literally, and came up with new goals and objectives. So the first one we came up with is identify areas based on existing neighborhood, natural characteristics, and existing physical boundaries to strategically plan for potential growth that is harmonious within the identified area. And then that goal really is a synthesis of CP1 and CP3, which I don't have those right in front of me, but that is what we kind of came up with based on those goals and comments. So I think what we'll do is we'll just start getting comments on these as we go through them, rather than waiting for all of it. Unless we start getting into things that are going to come up later, I think that's probably the best way to handle it. So if there's any comments on this overarching goal or any thoughts?
I think the word infrastructure should be in there.
Got it. I think you're right.
Because that could be a catalyst or preventative.
Yes. We'll work infrastructure in there. I think existing neighborhood and we'll add existing infrastructure, because that'll talk to building where sewers already are or water's accessible, or roads is the other piece of infrastructure. One of the kind of balancing acts we have to do is managing goal sentences, because a lot of times they can become run-on and they get very long. But I think adding another bullet like that is absolutely a good idea, and we can work that in.
I think the word harmonious, if you were to take one of the villages, for example, Citronia, Woodlawn, so when you use that word, if there were an area there in that existing neighborhood, I guess I've seen over the last several years on Planning Commission, the growth that has come has not been in keeping with that neighborhood concept. So when I see that there, I think that's a very good goal, but we believe we have had similar language, but we haven't had the growth or the.
Yeah, and one of the, harmonious came up in conversations at that first meeting, and I think it was in one of the other existing goals. And one of the things that we were talking about was having things harmonious within the identified area. So Green Walls has a specific identity, and there's some sort of boundary to it. The Jordan Valley has a distinct boundary and a distinct characteristic. And in some cases, the line between the two is pretty abrupt.
Mhm.
So you may want it harmonious within the area that it's in, but it may be okay if it's not harmonious with the next one. And the concept was that we talked about was European development. So you have the city, and then immediately you're out in the country. So you have those hard breaks. So that's one of the things that we were talking about with looking at it based on these characteristics and boundaries and identifying these areas. We don't have those areas identified. That'll be part of this process when we get into mapping. But the other piece of it is it allows us the flexibility to adjust based on the area plan. So if we have something comes up in Greenwalds and we want to tweak that area and that part of the comp plan, we can focus on just that area without having to necessarily update the whole plan. We can just do an amendment for an area. One of the ideas behind this.
We could talk about the community character of that specific area.
Yes. Yeah. And the 2009 comp plan also had character areas. So we're borrowing from that. Theirs were based on the transect, which is a development model. Continuum. Yes. So it goes from, dense to rural. So it's something along that continuum. And that's what started us talking about, it's okay to have an abrupt change sometimes between the two, between different transects. So that's one of the things that, I'm the mapping guy. I'm looking forward to actually going in and, looking at these natural boundaries or breaks, or whether it's the Jordan Creek or whether it's a road, a neighborhood, we can identify those areas.
Does harmonious also mean like compatible? Is that another word that you could use?
Yeah, and I think what the intent and with the comp plan is you're identifying things for future updates. So we're identifying this goal as when we update the zoning ordinance, or should we decide to update it, we're saying it should be consistent with this goal, harmonious within that character area. So that's something that, as we're crafting a zoning ordinance, we're going to jump back to our comp plan, say, is it consistent with this goal? Could we make this recommendation based on the comp plan? Is this harmonious? And that would be something that the Planning Commission would decide and make that recommendation to the Board of Commissioners. So kind of think of this as really a roadmap for moving forward and giving these broad concepts and ideas for future updates.
I can just quickly, so sorry,
Either one.
forgot about the mic. So something I know that's been helpful in other communities that we've worked in and resonated as we were talking about this, is kind of the concept of how this translates into the future land use map, and thinking about areas for primary growth, secondary growth, and then obviously the areas of preservation and to maintain or even to bring back to a more natural character. So it definitely is something that I think the continuum concept is quite useful to picture. But also when you begin to identify these areas on a map, it can very much help in terms of evaluating future land use and future developments that are coming before you.
Thank you for that explanation. I'm just curious, you mentioned, the European model for abrupt changes in developments. I don't know I guess based on the community feedback that I've heard with larger developments coming in, that I think one of the things the citizens have asked for is that abruptness is not palatable to most. Is there an option to have more of a gradual buffer so that it's not a stark, one type of neighborhood to another where those seem to clash? And is there another way to do that?
I think in some cases it may be appropriate to have an abrupt change. Others, it may not. And those are things that as we're going through this process, and zoning update is really where the teeth are, is that something to think about, is what is that transition? Does it make sense for it to be a hard stop, or is it a better idea to slowly, do the continuum type model moving out? And one of the things you see is density and increasing density where the infrastructure is, and especially if you want to protect outside, that is kind of how, some places you know where the sewers run because there's no development on the other side. So those are some concepts that will come up as we get through this process. So I think, I guess the answer is sometimes.
Thank you.
How would we address having more gradual transitions between different neighborhoods or different zones? Would there be some sort of like overlay district which, you know, adjusts the density so it's a gradual transition?
Well,
Trying to figure out how we would
yeah,
go about
and it gets into the zoning aspect within a neighborhood. And, you know, we're talking pretty big areas, like maybe 6 for the township. You can have different zones within the neighborhood, different land use characteristics. So you can add that continuum, build it into the land use plan so that it exists. And when we get to the land use plan, we can say this area makes sense for hard stop or continuum, a gradual change, kind of outward from the center. So there's a lot of concepts, and I could probably talk on this subject all night, and we got a lot to cover.
No, you couldn't. You could speak for yourself.
So I think for this one, adding infrastructure, I think we're okay with harmonious. We're not by any means finalizing this. So this is just to go out for public comment. So the idea is we might get comments. Public comment could be from you guys. If you think of something on the way home, I really should have put this in here. Once we get it up on the website, drop that comment in. So I don't want anybody to think that we're locking into this tonight, but it's locking it in to get to the next step for public comment.
I appreciate that because I struggle looking at that word because my definition of harmonious, Diane's definition, or Bill's, 3 different.
Yep.
So somebody in the future reads that, they're like, harmonious is build, or
Right.
nothing, nothing, nothing.
And that's one of the things that we have to balance is the ambiguity versus, you know, very concise. So a lot of times goals and objectives are pretty ambiguous and they use fluffy terms. So that's kind of where that is. And it gets more focused as we move forward in the process.
Yeah, it's specifically, once we do the zoning ordinance, the saldo, that gives you the chance to really dive in and say, okay, in this block of 34th Street, what we believe harmonious is this. And, you know, this is the big broad brush. So this is the grand ideas. Once you start amending ordinances, then you dig in and then do the nitty gritty research and get that done.
So the next goal we came up with was a combination of 4 goals and the guiding principles. So plan for future land use development and redevelopment to remain within the capacity to install and maintain infrastructure in a fiscally responsible manner. So we talked about fiscally responsible at the first meeting. This talks in infrastructure. I think fiscally responsible, one of the things that we talked about was maintenance and maintenance plans and things like that. So that's where this goal came from. So any comments on this one? Again, there's time. Just this is for going out to the public. If there's any big things that you want changed, we can kind of address those now. But again, I think the other thing that we talked about doing was trying to have only a couple goals rather than having a whole bunch of goals, like the last comp plan had a ton. So these are kind of the 2 overarching goals that we have. We talk about harmonious character based on the neighborhood. We talk about fiscally responsible and infrastructure, kind of the two themes. And then the goals from the 2009 comp plan and the guiding principles started to focus on specific topic areas. So the resource protection goal that we came up, which combined one of the guiding principles and one of the comp plan goals, was to optimize the protection, conservation, and preservation of natural, historic, agricultural, and scenic resources. So we will get into this piece of it in more, hopefully, if I can stop talking so much, but get to this in a lot more detail. And I think one of the things, I think Al brought it up, was when we get these goals and objectives, go back and look at the overarching stuff to see how it fits.
Make sure everything still fits.
Yeah. So this kind of goal is setting the stage for the next conversation of the resource protection, and we can kind of go back and look at it and make changes to it. Because again, this is a reiterative process, and we're going through it and working through it. So to me, it's a pretty straightforward. One of the things that I've been pushing and is putting in scenic resources. And we'll get into a little more detail on how we define that, things like that, later in the conversations. So any thoughts on that one?
Yes, for resource protection, one of the other meetings, transfer of development rights was discussed in order to preserve farmland. Is that something, we'll investigate and, seek input on as we get into discussing that in more detail, resource protection?
Yes. The concept of, when we get to resource protection, I want to kind of talk about the process that we use to get to that. And one of the things that will come up is there's some things that ended up in specific topics like agricultural that can be moved to the overall resource. TDR is one of those concepts. So it doesn't have to just be for farmland. It can be for woodlands or steep slope areas. And we'll get into all of that in more detail.
Okay.
And TDR is a tool. So we haven't really gotten into what tools we're going to use to do these. That gets into implementation.
TDR is,
Transfer of development rights.
okay.
Community utilities, again, guiding principle and 2 comp plan goals: ensure that the township is efficiently served by utility infrastructure appropriate to the level of development and within the available capacity of the utilities. So this speaks to, looking at capacity when we look at development. And Greg and I have been talking about impacts of development and what those are and how to quantify those and how to plan for those. So this speaks directly to that, what impacts development has on our utility. I'm just going to keep going. Stop me if something comes up. So for housing, this one was pretty much, I think we reworked it a little bit, but it was a comp plan goal. And we also looked at the workbooks in the housing working group. Provide a variety of housing and neighborhood choices that meet the needs of all generations with consideration of family sizes, abilities, and income levels. So this is, housing for all generations, all incomes, all family sizes, all abilities. So having that flexibility, and it's like one of the things with the aging is, our housing stock, we have a good variety. So already, So we have the ability to see the turnover in neighborhoods, which is frankly, from a planning perspective, is pretty exciting to actually see this work. So that's what the housing goal talks to. And again, all of these we can get back into in more detail. Transportation, facilitate the safe and efficient movement of people and goods, encourage and promote multimodal transportation choices. 2 comp plan goals, 1 guiding principle. So it talks to one of the things we wanted to highlight is multimodal. We wanted to bring that up. So bike, pedestrian. There's been a big push for planning commission with sidewalks and getting the connectivity and things like that. So that's really where that piece comes to. Safe and efficient movement talks about traffic. Looking at both people and goods. So looking at freight movement, especially with warehouses in the township and warehouses in other townships. Addressing that and figuring out how that impacts our community.
You might want to put services in there, because transportation can be not just vehicular, it could be pipelines, electricity. You know, there's
So like the conveyance of utilities,
right
like rights of way and
railroads, you know, that's goods, but
right,
it could be
right.
like a service is another element that shouldn't be forgotten. Because
Right.
we have pipelines that run right through over here. So,
Yep. There's with the 309 interchange project, the Tillman Street interchange, is Sunoco's down there. Yes. Thank you. Community facilities, promote an effective continuation of opportunities, facilities, and services for parks, recreation, education, public safety, and wellness. Again, a guiding principle and a comp plan goal kind of wrapped up in one. And these are very broad. Again, once we get into those topics, we're probably going to want to make tweaks to it. But for now, it's kind of a good starting point.
does opportunities also mean like enhancement of services? Like public safety?
Yeah, I think an opportunity is not just a new park or a new building, but the opportunity to rehabilitate or repurpose are things that are absolutely opportunities.
Right.
And one of the things that came up is adaptive reuse. So that's to me just another opportunity.
Okay, so that's the what, the goals are the what, and the strategies are the how we do it.
Yes. So strategies and implementation are kind of the how. So for 2022 strategies, again, we kind of wanted to keep it high level and save a lot of the strategies for the individual sections. And these strategies would kind of inform the other strategies. So this one we came up with, again, a combination of a comp plan goal and a guiding principle. Promote planning, zoning, and design techniques to remain within the capacity to install and maintain infrastructure in a fiscally responsible manner. Very similar to the second goal, but it talks about how you can do that by promoting planning, zoning, and design. So that's kind of where that one comes from. Another
Question on that one.
Yep.
Fiscally responsible manner. To Brian Height's comment earlier, it's a subjective term depending on who you ask. Is there an opportunity to have a capital improvements plan township-wide that would actually have a framework to match the growth that we're proposing? and have that tied, which is a little more tangible and achievable as opposed to
So,
being
yeah,
fiscally responsible.
one of the things that will definitely come up in community facilities is the capital improvement plan. And look at all the different types of facilities and look at what improvements need to be done. And for Board of Commissioners, having that information in that plan, to me, I think would be invaluable, because if something, you have things that need to be done and are identified, but if something comes out of, you feel that it came out of left field, you see if it's in the plan or not. If it's way down low, there was some reason that it was way down low on the plan. And maybe there was something that needed to bump it up, but at least gives that framework the aid in the decision-making process. And that's kind of what all of this is to help with decision-making moving forward.
Well, my point in asking that is, I know we've talked about having an implementable plan. And I guess as I've been thinking about this last couple of days, I feel like a capital plan goes hand in hand with the growth. I mean, they have to happen at the same time. Not exactly, but in tandem. And I think that's one of the things, as I read through the old plan, I think it would have been nice to see some definitive goals tied to it that might have been more markers that we could have latched onto to
Yeah,
track
and
the progress of implementation.
I think it's, when we talk about implementation, there's going to be specific tasks, so that when we go back and look in the next strategy, we'll talk to this, is when you go back, you can look at that implementation matrix, say this was done, wasn't done, why wasn't it done, was it investigated, what was the decision, so that as we're moving forward with this, there's a record, so that as commission changes, planning commission change, you can go back and see that history of why were decisions made. And that's one of the things that we're looking to do in this implementation piece, is have that, again, that roadmap moving forward. So as we progress and as this plan ages, you have the ability to go back and look and see why something was or wasn't done. One of the things with 2009 comp plan was there were verbs like consider, and what does that mean? And if that's pretty vague, and it could be who consider. And so when we get to implementation, we're trying to get those more concrete and definitive for sure. So it's a very clear as to what is meant by that. And I see capital improvement plan being one of those implementable items.
Thank you.
Yeah, it would seem to me that as you move into a budgeting cycle, one of the first things that you should do is pick up the comprehensive plan, check out the implementation, and publicly review it.
That's an excellent suggestion. Thank you.
And PennDOT basically doing that right now with the Transportation Improvement Program update, federal highways. You got to have, it's $450 million, but it's fiscally constrained. You can't, or PennDOT would just build everything and then, charge Dave's kids in the future to pay for it. So there's fiscally responsible. It's also, let's not mortgage the farm in order to accomplish what we need to.
Right.
We gotta do it in a
And that's something we
timeline.
can, if there's a better term that comes up out of this process, we can certainly go back in and tweak that.
Yeah, I don't like
Because
the term
it is
fiscally constrained. I don't like that term.
I don't like that one either, but
But everybody knows what it means. It's like,
yeah,
you can't
Yeah.
just print money like the federal government does.
and one board might think it's okay to bond for everything, another board won't. And what is that? Is that responsible? To one board it might be, and to another one it might not. So those are absolutely things that we need to consider, and as we're again going through this, we'll figure out how best to tweak language. Work with regional agencies and neighboring municipalities to coordinate and share services where feasible. This again comes out of the comp plan and guiding principles. I think the big one is neighboring municipalities is one of the things that is a hard thing to do. But I think, and this also kind of talks to, we've talked about multi-municipal planning, whether it's a full-blown plan or it's a specific topic area or a specific corridor study or things like that may come up that require regional look and a adjacent municipality look. So there's opportunities for lots of coordination and shared services, and having these comp plans out there and identifying things. The neighboring municipality can pick it up and let's see what they said about it. So those are things that are good to put in here so that moving forward, everybody kind of is on the same page. This one talks to, I think, the capital improvement plan. Develop measures, benchmarks for municipal services, utilities to help guide future refinements and expansions to municipal function. To me, that kind of talks to maintenance and service of utilities and all of our services and things that I think municipal functions is probably the biggest piece of it. We're looking at what the municipality can do, what it should do. It's incorporated into the comp. What's that?
One.
Oh, it's in a different order.
Article, and I have ballot measures last.
Okay, here it is. I saved the new one for last in the presentation. Periodically re-examine the comprehensive plan to identify progress, major problems, significant changes, and areas requiring revision or adjustments for the comprehensive plan and/or development regulations of the township. This talks to, not waiting 10 years to update the comprehensive plan, continually looking at it and setting that framework of what exactly you're looking at. So this comes from New Jersey. The municipal land use law requires re-examination reports. I think it's every 6 years. And there's guidance and questions, and you go through that. So I see this as an activity, and whatever duration is decided, an activity for the Planning Commission to conduct, prepare a re-examination report. That re-examination report then gets sent to BOC. So if there's things that come out of it, BOC is aware of what they need to look out for. Any planning projects coming down the pipe. Also worked into here is progress on the implementation. Be an implementation report as part of that.
I think the most important, or one of the most important ones, is actually the first periodic plan to actually get us started, because sometimes these reports get written and then get put on the shelf.
Exactly. And having this in here and again, putting it in front of everybody so that everybody's aware, hopefully won't fall through the cracks. But yeah, the first one is probably the most important.
With the requirement for the Planning Commission to make an annual report to the Board of Commissioners, instead of saying periodically, would it make sense to say annually in conjunction with that report? Because at least it's measurable and there may not be major information to hand over to the governing body, but
right, at least there, I think we left it as periodically because we weren't sure on that time frame. Because I think it depends on how robust you make that reexamination report. Whether it's a big lift and things that it's going to be hard to do every year, or if we craft it so it is an easier job to prepare the whole report annually, is kind of why we left it periodically. And something that just pops into my head is we do an implementation report as part of the annual report, but then maybe do this reexamination report biannually, so that we're getting little pieces of it and not putting that big burden all in 1 year or annually.
I think if you do annually, you have to consider that perhaps you're overdoing it, where the reports come so often that you don't see a larger change going on that you would see if you sat back and waited 2, 3, 4 years. And once again, that speaks to how often do we want to do these things? Because I feel that an annual report, once again, it might occur so often that you actually don't see the changes as they occur. So just something to consider.
And I think leaving it like this and working through that and deciding, again, the comprehensive plan is the broad brush. When we get into the details, whether it's a policy of the Board of Commissioners or a planning commission policy that says, here's the reports that we're going to do annually, here's what we're going to do biannually, all of that will get worked into the implementation plan. Get to that piece, talk about that.
Thank you.
One of the things that New Jersey uses this for is if there's a major problem or a significant change that pops up, you can go in and do a reexamination report and change zoning based on that change. So it's a good tool to react so that you don't have to update an entire plan or entire zoning ordinance. You can focus on specific areas or specific problems or things that come up.
That's what I was going to say. I wouldn't want to wait on an annual basis for a major problem. If it's major, we should address it immediately.
Yes,
So,
and I think having that flexibility in there, and when we get to implementation, having the flexibility that says you can do it at any time should something come up. We'll have to work that language in and figure out how best to.
And it could also be a little section in our annual report. This is what our major problems were. We had no major problems. There might be, whatever tweaks that are required. So I think there is a section in our annual report for this, not necessarily a full autopsy on an annual basis. That could be arduous. That would probably be another staff member. So it's just a matter of a balance of, especially when you start implementing these things, there might be more need to address things like, well, we really missed that. We got to address it.
We got to address it right away. And that's also one of the thoughts behind looking at specific neighborhoods and areas. So if we have Jordan Valley as an area, something comes up in the Jordan Valley, we can focus on that area without having to bring everything else in.
Right. And or a scenario is like we plan for this amount of sewer allocation. Something changes with Klein's Island. It's a pull the emergency brake and change.
Yep.
Maybe what you ultimately want to do is say every third year or sooner is required.
Yeah. So as required is absolutely the language we could put in.
That way,
But I think, adding a piece of this to the annual report, whether we have time to work through that, figure out exactly what to put in. But again, there's been one of the problems with comp plans is most of the time they get put on a shelf, is to work things into the plan itself that will help prevent that.
Because initially when we do if we do the rezoning or whatever we do, that's going to be a significant change.
Yep.
Not necessarily of this adopted plan, but a policy and an ordinances as a township. So I think it's good to document it.
Yeah.
And how we got there. So when none of us are here anymore, the next people go, what were they thinking?
Yeah, why would they zone it like that?
I look at the 2009 and I was involved, and Bill was involved, and Al was involved, and sometimes I didn't even know what we were thinking. So, you know, you learn from your
Yes.
experiences. So
Yeah.
not necessarily mistakes, it's just things change. So I think it's good to document it in some form or fashion. And the annual report somebody's going to look at, it's easier to look at it, that kind of.
And one of the things that we did in New Jersey is zoning hearing boards did an annual report, because those annual reports identified common variances. So if there's a common variance that they see all the time, that annual report would go to the planning commission would look and see, oh, something's going on with this setback, or something's going on with this height ordinance, or so let's go look at that. So it's another piece that we can kind of build into this, is somehow getting that list from the zoning hearing board, build it into, again, it's compiling information for decision making, really what. So one bottle of water down.
Or one
1 hour in, so on pace.
So what the plan is, we're going to take these goals, put them on the website, and we have to figure out how that link's going to be structured, whether it's a text box that just gets emailed or write an email. But we'll put those on the website under the comp plan page and try and get comment. Announcement on the home page somewhere, and we'll work through that piece of it. The idea is to get comments on these before next meeting.
And we're looking for resident
We can
comments.
put something in, yeah, we'll put a comment. Maybe it's a survey, or we'll figure out how best to handle that. So meeting flow. So new element. So this is how we did the first section. So we did goals and objectives. We reviewed everything. We had board of commissioner comment, public comment, planning commission comment, prioritization. Then we come to, we're at open comment, additional goals, implementable actions. So that's kind of where we are. Now we jump into a new element. And for this one, we had to shift it because we had the technical difficulty at the last meeting. We had planning commission prioritization up front. So we sent the Mentimeter to the planning commission. Just a comment is, this was a little more difficult, I think, for us to compile and put together all of the goals and objectives, because we didn't have that comment discussion prior to. So what we're going to see is more of a reorganization of the goals and objectives, as opposed to, putting different pieces together. So I think we'll still, after tonight, we'll go back in, put things together. So what I'm recommending is that we go back for the next meeting, back to the way we ran the first meeting. We'll do the prioritization in the meeting. Now that we have access to Mentimeter expert, we can run it that way.
If you're going to run it that way, you got to have the internet.
Yes, you do. Yeah, so the guest Wi-Fi, sometimes the router needs to be restarted. I have to get IT access, IT room access for that. But yes, absolutely. So one of the things we came up against with this resource protection, there were so many goals and objectives. Or when the planning commission was going through them, or I don't even know how many, like 13 slides worth. So that was also part of the problem. There were too many, so it's hard to kind of really go through and understand, the priorities of everybody without the discussion. So this first one, we looked at working group recommendations, funding sources came up top, and then preservation toolbox were the second. So all of this is going to get worked in to new goals and objectives implementation. One of the things that we found is the bulk of this was related to implementation and strategies, as opposed to goals. So a lot of this you'll see implementation as we go through. We can kind of get into, one of the things we're going to have to do is look at each of these implementation items and put them together and combine things and clarify what is meant by each of them as we get through that. The resource protection, the goal that came out of the previous exercise was optimize the protection, conservation, and preservation of natural, historic, agricultural, and scenic resources. As we went through were there 100, maybe 50? As we went through the 50 or so, this really jumped out at us. Preserve resources that are important to the unique characteristics of the township. And that should be.
Is there a coordinating page in our packet for
Yes,
this?
let me look at that.
Eight.
Yeah, so it starts with to identify.
Thank you.
Yep. So identify and prioritize. Again, this talks to the process that we were going through. Identify and prioritize came up, but those are action verbs. So we pulled those out as a strategy to identify and prioritize resources that are important to the unique characteristics. So that may not be in your in the Word document. Some of this, again, it took us a long time to look at these. So there's going to be some tweaks in the presentation compared to the document. This is one of those tweaks. So the other piece of this is, as we go through, you'll see preserve resources. That resources, we just took that out and replaced it with the topic area. So the goal for each section is preserve agricultural resources that are important to the unique characteristics of the town. So we reuse that goal for each of these resource protections. So it familiarizes everybody with it. Helps us, I think unique characteristics is one of the things that we're going to go into that next strategy, identify and prioritize. What is unique about the township? What is worth protecting? Big question. So again, some of these are going to be in the table, and some are going to be we pulled out of the table and kind of put on the presentation, things that we thought were really important. And I think for this process, we want to kind of find out if you guys agree with us that these are the big highlights of each of these.
So the important ones are not in the table?
In the presentation, There's a table in the presentation. We pulled out a couple of these, combined some, and they'll be in this presentation. So this is an example. It's the second line on your on the table, but we pulled it out and put it onto the slide because we thought it
Are these in order of priority or
was.
just?
They are not.
Okay.
They are not. That's the other challenge we had, was getting the priorities.
Okay.
So that's why we kind of took this table and tried to pull the more important things out. Direct development to areas with access to infrastructure. Pretty straightforward. Utilize protected areas to limit development in hazard-prone areas. So an example is floodplain. You don't want to have development in floodplains. So the idea is to protect those floodplains. Development on steep slopes, challenging. It's possible, but it's also not. There are hazards associated with that. So if there's protection in there, you limit development in those areas where there's a potential hazard. Protect scenic resources. One of the things that I'm going to talk about Ridge Farm, elephant in the room, so to speak, is the scenic value of that at the busiest intersection of the township is probably, to me, part of the reason that it had such an impact that it did. It was a valuable scenic resource because everybody to me, it was busiest intersection. The community grew up with this farm, and these are things that we are worth protecting. And driving up over the hill, you look out and you see farmland. So there's ways that we can look at view shed analysis. So from the top of the hill, what can you see? What can't you see? Does it make sense to have tuck the development behind the hill or in a different section of the property? So using the concept of scenic resources and visual, what you see driving down the road, talks to buffers. So putting in a big buffer along the road as opposed to having development right up against the road. So things, and again, this gets into the character areas and neighborhoods. Is some areas it makes sense to have development against the road because you want a Main Street feel. Others, it doesn't. So that's another reason to have these character areas and neighborhoods to protect some of these scenic resources. So this is where I took the tables and just put in the remainder, and a lot of it is going to be implementation items that we're going to have to put more detail in. So what I'll do is I'll go through I think if you look at the funding sources, preservation toolbox, official map, the line for protect agricultural heritage, we moved to the ag. Came up with something for that piece. So support investment in greenways, that kind of talks to the connectivity. That was one that we saw over and over again. It's talking about connectivity, trail gaps, greenways. There were a whole bunch of different items that talk to that. So that's kind of what this section is. Assess public's view on farmland preservation and the use of taxpayer money to preserve more farms in South Whitehall. That's something that was in there 2 to 3 times. So there's a lot of items and a lot of overlap. And this is kind of where an example of the challenge that we had in putting all of this together. without those comments. So I think having comment tonight is going to help us put things together. And the other piece of this is one of the things that, for that example of farmland preservation and the taxpayer money to preserve farms, one of the things that I would like to see is more than just farms. There are resources that are worth protecting, maybe worth using taxpayer dollars to protect, that aren't necessarily a farm. There's woodlands, there's steep slopes, there's riparian areas, wetlands, natural heritage areas, all of these different things that, to me, we shouldn't just focus on farmland, because there's a lot more available out there. And here's protection of, consider resource protection through transfer of development or purchase of development rights. So that is kind of what, when you do a conservation easement, you're purchasing development rights. The person still owns the property, but they just can't build extra houses on it, buying that development. And that's kind of how these programs get built. And, you know, the development rights is what you're really trying to use as your protection tool. Cluster development near crossroad villages. That was one that came out of Lehigh Valley, the LVPC plan. Also was in our comp plan. Talked about, again, the cluster concept of that development in a centralized area and preserving the outward areas. And that's something where that hard line we talked about, have your little village, right outside the village is your forest and your farmland. Kind of like that little hamlet feel, is really what that kind of talks about. So that's resource protection. That's a lot. I'd like to open it up and get comment and thoughts and ideas and see, you know, what, because we're going to use that to put this together and make it even more concise.
Can I just ask, for bookkeeping, you didn't say anything about encouraging climate change resiliency or protecting wildlife or protecting agricultural heritage or connectivity, close gaps. Those you didn't include in.
Some of them are worked into other pieces.
Okay, I just wanted to.
Yeah, the agricultural heritage, I know we worked into, that got rolled into ag protection.
Okay. And then you added the one with the not only preserving farmland, but other resources too.
Yeah. So and that's kind of, I guess, another thing worth discussing is, you know, is it just farmland or is it the other thing? But that gets to prioritization. We have, and I've done the mapping for all of, probably not all of our resources, but the majority of the resources that I can map have been mapped. We can go through those and develop prioritization, which then we put into a GIS model, comes up with areas that are prioritized for development or for protection based on input. So if the board or whoever we have working on this prioritizes farmland over another one, that'll get bumped up to the top in that prioritization.
I think it would be important to know how many farms we have and how many unique farm owners we have. That could be very telling of where this would go.
Yeah, so the number of the majority of the farmland is owned by big landowners. And I think I'm gonna go off script. And I'm gonna just start jumping around as we're having this conversation, because I think it's gonna help us moving forward, because there's a lot of overlap with this. One of the things that we talked about with agriculture, and one of the things that I want to talk about, and it's a concept that everybody needs to be aware of, is a lot of times the economics of farming and agriculture in the US in general is the asset and the equity farmer builds is often their retirement, sending their kids to school.
It's their 401k.
It's their 401k. They're building that into their land, selling it to development. So it's not always the case. It's a generalization.
Historically, farmers don't want their kids being farmers. It's a hard life.
It's a hard life. Yes. Yeah.
But I would add that I think we've seen a change in the last 2 years with COVID. We've all seen supply chain issues. I think that statements that you're making were very true, but I think there's a little turn to the side now because we've got a different focus, and in some areas it's difficult to get food items, and I think we're seeing a little bit of a shift to, you know what, if we grow things locally. I actually had a resident want to meet with me last week to talk about that. What would South Whitehall do as a government if food issues and shortages happened here? And I had a good conversation with her about it, about we're very fortunate to have some farms for certain corns specifically here, but it's something that's on the minds of our community. And I think we shouldn't lose sight of what COVID is refocusing some people on. So
And
I think that's something to factor in.
and so it's exactly what we were talking about staff meeting as we were going through. And we came up with under agricultural resource protection is respond to the changing realities of modern agriculture in the Lehigh Valley by encouraging polyculture farming, family farms, farm stands, farm ads. These are all concepts that COVID has kind of shifted the mentality and supply chain and things like that. And it's right now it's pretty, we don't have anything concrete, but we were thinking about doing it as a call out, separate page in the document, changing farms and changing dynamics and things like that, and tools we can use to encourage that.
And I just would add, I think it's also speaks to what you said about supply chain, because it's diversifying our local economy and our local options. And we have some good examples here in the Lehigh Valley, like the seed farm, Rodale, where we're seeing folks who are interested in, homesteading, if that's what it first is, and then it becomes, a small or mid-sized farm. And so that was an exciting development in the discussion, because that is a unique asset, I think, that we see in South Whitehall that could really be, brought into this plan at the forefront.
Now, how would that be implemented, just to get, like, does South Whitehall become a farm, the farm owner?
Well, we do own a farm now. So I think we can do tweaks to the zoning ordinance to encourage. I mean, I'm sure it's already in there, but allowing farm stands to sell locally grown. The trick for a lot of this, and I've probably said it a lot of times, and is incentivizing what you want to happen. So if there's a way for us to build into our zoning ordinance an incentive to do polyculture farming. So farming other than just one crop. You're growing the crops for your farm stand. If there's a way for us to put that in, build that into our zoning ordinance, you get to build twice as big a farm stand, something like that. For every crop type, you get 100 square feet of farm stand, something like that. I mean, these are just ideas and concepts that I'm sure there's examples, and as we go in, we're going to do the research and pull up examples of how we can encourage these types of things.
One you might look at is right outside of Pocono Raceway, Pocono Organic Farm. It's so popular, it's crazy. People, like my wife and I, drive up there. Well, my brother lives right down the road, but it's all organic. It's all hydroponic. It's like they just built it a couple of years ago, like perfect timing with COVID, and it's phenomenal. And it's a small acreage. It's maybe 10, 15 acres.
And that the idea of farmettes, is the Forerunner still up there?
Yes.
So the concept of farmettes is smaller farms. So one of the things that when we talk about development rights, if there's 100 acres and you purchase 100 development rights, 1 acre lots, incentivizing for them, well, the incentive would be for them to carve that up into 4 25-acre farms. And then they could sell 4 farms instead of just 1 farm. So that talks to some of those incentives we can build into zoning. For every farmette, you get, if we're doing cluster housing or conservation and subdivision, for every 25-acre farmette, you get 5 extra houses or something like that. Those are those concepts to help encourage some of this.
It's also understanding the market, basically, because farms are still pretty much, they're income generators, and we have to recognize that and create our ordinances to allow the things they need to do to actually survive financially. I mean, right now, our zoning ordinance in ag, you need 5 acres. And we're already seeing pressure that, somebody wants to do a small 2-acre farm. Well, that means a trip to the zoning hearing board to allow them to do that. Well, let's change that. But we have to understand what farming today is becoming and write those rules into the zoning ordinance to allow and incentivize.
How do you figure that out? Is it like the Pocono one would be an example? Are there other examples we could follow to?
Hannah brought up the Seed Farm and Rodale, both local, and I would envision absolutely hitting them up. Her thoughts too. And Hannah, I'm sure you have.
Yeah, no, there's, I think in that space, it's kind of an it's educational and training opportunities to build out those who may want to make this investment in the scale. I mean, I'm sure folks may be familiar with Crooked Row Farm, just up 309. There's, I think, some really great models, again, that have gotten huge infusions from COVID and people wanting to shop locally and finding ways to engage in the local economy. But those were some of the local examples that we thought of. Yeah.
Thank you. I also wanted to bring up St. Luke's Anderson campus, and we do partner with St. Luke's for many things, so it might be a good resource as well.
Also, the Lehigh Career Technical Institute has a horticultural, agricultural, they have their own greenhouse up there. So they might have ideas that we could pick their brain at.
Or promote farming at the high school.
I think it's, again, looking at the changing reality. Like Greg said, if a 2-acre farm is the most profitable way to handle this, we should incentivize that,
It's like,
or at least permit it at a minimum.
when does a garden become a farm? Like we have a garden in our drop-off center.
Yeah.
Which actually looks nice, nothing's growing yet, but what's the scale that garden becomes profitable?
Mhm.
That's the main thing, is to make these
Right, and
profitable.
that
Sustainable.
same concept applies to incentivizing the type of development you want. Needs to be profitable for the landowner. So if 25-acre farms are equal in profitability to 25-acre farms at a specific, with these incentives thrown on top and uses and things, makes it as profitable as a single family development with 25 homes, 100 homes. So those are things that, we want to look at. And the comp plan is really our opportunity to identify these things that we want to incentivize. Sounds like this is kind of really hitting a good topic and something that definitely of interest moving forward with it, which is, to me, is pretty exciting. I have a garden, but it's definitely not a farm.
But then, you talk about vertical farms, not just the traditional farm anymore.
Yeah, and repurposing of warehouses,
Right.
industrial buildings, and paying attention to changes is an important thing. And again, that's talks to the reexamination report. Is if we have that built in, this major change in technology comes where it's profitable to grow hydroponically in a specific building, and we have a stock of those buildings. Let's do this reexamination report, do the zone change, and make it happen. So being able to react is an important piece of this.
I have one other comment. I think maybe it's within some of these strategies, but the thing that I didn't see or that we haven't discussed yet is open space, just in a general sense. I mean, we're talking about specific farms or the greenway, but within developments or within neighborhoods to promote trails and walk, preserving green open space where we can. I don't know if that's something we could add or if it's somewhere else in your strategies.
I think it might be embedded in the idea of conservation subdivision and clustering, because that's where within a specific development, you're incentivizing them to put all of the houses in one corner, preserving everything else. It's kind of built into that, but the idea of, and then also the idea of greenways and that connectivity for trails, we should absolutely build in. And I guess I don't know whether it becomes something where we're going to have to think about it for a while and let it marinate, so to speak. But whether it's something that is a big goal in the comp plan or it's more applicable for zoning, but the concept, like one of the things that we get hung up on, and I think this is where you're going with it, is we get hung up on development of big tracts of land and big development, but you also have the infill development where you have a parcel and you're either redeveloping it or it's a vacant parcel, and oftentimes they get built out. Maximum, they build it out as much as they can. And that could be tweaks in our zoning. If there is a adjacent open space, we'll give you a impervious, well, not impervious coverage or height exception. We'll give you an extra 10 feet on your building if you preserve your adjacent open space. So those are things where you're looking at a specific lot development, which is the majority of what we see and the planning commission sees is, individual lots rather than the big tracts. So these goals can go all the way down into that individual.
Can I just ask a follow-up clarifying question? Are you envisioning this open space as being potentially new public programmed or manicured space, or are you thinking?
That's what I was going to ask is my concept of open space and everybody else's could be vastly different. People think park recreation is open space, but if you have a house near the Lehigh County soccer fields with the lights in the middle of the night, you might not think that's open space, especially on Saturdays when it gets a little chaotic over there. I didn't mean to jump on you.
No, that's okay. No, I don't mean necessarily parks or recreation, just green space sometimes, or areas of respite, trails. I don't like to necessarily use the word trails, but walkability in a development to connect to others, just mobility in general.
Passive recreation.
Passive. Yeah.
And
Yeah, that's it.
No,
Passive.
please.
I was just going to say, and I think we've been touching on this, is the incentivized part is how do you push for, or not push in a bad way, but really ensure that you're getting through this new development amenities that meet the needs of the community, whether it be passive, active, and then maybe it's not something that has to be obviously maintained by the township, if maybe it's a public-private partnership. And obviously you all have good examples of that already, but could be something to potentially strengthen.
And just to kind of piggyback is open space to me doesn't have to be programmed, and it doesn't have to have a trail in it, and it doesn't have to have anything in it. It's just there, and that's why I've been kind of pushing this concept of scenic resources. As you're driving by, what are you looking at? One of the things we were very successful with in Sparta, where my previous municipality, was our cluster subdivision. And I have to go back and look at it because I was, junior staffer there. But when a lot of these subdivisions were coming in, they were very successful at getting the open space dedicated near the main road. So as you drive by, you see the entrance. It's a wooded entrance, and back in the woods, you have your subdivision. You have your homes. So it maintains the rural character driving by. So you see the woods, you don't see the houses. I think is one of the concepts I'm trying to push with the scenic and visual and things you see and feel as you're driving down a road to maintain character.
I think that's a great concept that I think would be embraced by our community.
We've talked about overall agriculture, historic. One I'm going to kind of highlight, and I'm hoping we can come back with more details on some of this at the next meeting. Again, that overarching goal, preserve historic resources that are important to the unique characteristics. One of the things, did I get it in here? We talked about encourage rehabilitation, awareness and education. One of the working groups was telling the story of South Whitehall, the historic story, and kind of building all of that into whether it's directly in the comp plan or pointed at informing a historic resource or historic preservation committee or something. That committee could be the one tasked with putting that story together. So that's something. One of the other things that came out of, I guess, the 2009 comp plan was designating historic properties as sending areas under a TDR program. So if you have a historic property, you're willing to preserve it, you can take that development right and apply it somewhere else. So that would, in essence, preserve that farm, but if they want to build a new house, they don't have to knock it down. They can take that development right and move it somewhere else.
Where would the somewhere else be?
That's what we have to figure out. Yeah,
That seems to be a key part of that.
it is the key part of transfer of development right.
We'd have to,
You have to have some place that you're willing to accept more
here's the
density.
somewhere else where we put all those credits to.
Yes.
You need to keep track of it too.
Well, there's some mechanisms that we've talked about so that we don't have to keep track of it. It comes in as a plan, a TDR plan to the Planning Commission, and it gets memorialized by an approval. And then it's on the developer to come back with the deed restriction, because the developer doesn't want to go through the whole engineering if they're not going to get that TDR approved. So the idea is to, again, this talks to incentivizing, is we also need to make it easy to do things that we want to get done. So if it's easy for a developer to do a TDR program and they're going to get a benefit from it, they're going to do it. If it's, you got to go to the bank and you got to have it tracked and, what's the value, and that just makes it a lot more complicated.
Well, it does have to be economically feasible too.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. But the idea is to put it on the developer and let them decide. We identified the sending and receiving zones. Is kind of that concept.
I always struggle with the term historic.
Can you mute?
Historic is,
Somebody else's.
Dave Wilson, are you trying to say something?
No, my sound was going out. And then I don't have any comment.
Can you mute? Okay.
anyway, historic, I always struggle with, like, what's the definition of historic? Certain PennDOT programs say 50 years. My house is historic because it was built in 69.
Unfortunately, that keeps moving up. Yeah.
Right. So it's like,
So yes, and that's another thing where if we had, one of the things I'm envisioning for this comp plan is to identify additional plans to be done. One of those would be a historic preservation plan. In it, I would envision what is the definition of what is historic. These are the criteria that we're looking at. And there's guidelines in National Historic Registry, and there's tons of resources on that piece.
did we have historics on our official map?
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
we did.
So. I look at so many maps, I forget when I live.
Now, only a few,
Right.
so we can add and probably should.
So the other piece of historic I wanted to bring up is one of the issues you have with historic buildings is the maintenance of those buildings. It costs money to maintain buildings, and developing some sort of program, whether it's partnering with other organizations to identify these properties and help with the maintenance of them, is important to make those buildings last, because the roof goes, then there's water inside, and it's an uphill battle to restore it. So there almost needs to be a minimum amount of maintenance on these buildings. So I think that's a piece that is often overlooked in plans, is developing that maintenance piece. It's something that I think is pretty important to work in.
Well, additionally, and adaptive reuse. Certain things we have to recognize that we don't have the capabilities to preserve as they were, so we can accept a lower level of historical accuracy while allowing the owner to adaptively reuse it. Once again, which can be very financially rewarding if done correctly.
And just a little to tie into that is, with adaptive reuse, a lot of times to me, it's related to form-based codes where you're more worried about what the outside appearance is than what the inside use is. Somebody may have a great use for this historic building, but it doesn't fit in our use schedule. So I think when we're thinking about adaptive reuse, is an opportunity for, a multitude of different things that may not be what we envision in the zoning ordinance as a new use. So, a daycare in a historic building compared to a new daycare, or that. I'm kind of trying to
Medical
find a
office
good example.
building in a farmhouse.
Yes. A doctor's office in a farmhouse as
Right.
opposed to a new one. So maybe that becomes a use, is a specific adaptive reuse is in the use schedule. We come up with ideas to build around that. But so there's a lot of things with adaptive reuse that we're more concerned with preserving the building than as much of what that use in that building is.
I can think of two that are very in that vein. One is down in Quakertown off of Spinnerstown. An old barn they turned into a medical office building.
Yes.
The other one's out in Musselm Springs. Was a restaurant they turned into a medical office building, but they kept the character of it.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I can see where you're leading.
Yeah. So the St. Luke's Medical Office Building is on 663 there, and they maintained the barn and kind of added onto that. So maintain that character and that quality. And it wasn't as restrictive as historic National Register, and it let them take some liberties with it, but maintain the character. So those are things that we should absolutely work in. I want to get to natural resources. So water quality came up several times. There's surface water and subsurface water. So surface water would be on the surface. Subsurface is utility water. Think of wells, and ways to protect that. This is also in one of the ordinance amendments. There was a series of ordinance amendments recommended. We didn't list them here, but we'll go through when we start looking at implementation, and how best to kind of categorize these and kind of put them into their appropriate bucket. we'll look at that. And then a lot of this is looking at partners, who to partner with. And to me, that is one of the tools to accomplish preservation, is identifying the appropriate partner to help use their skill set and their tools that they have available is very important. Woodlands and trees, one of the things that I feel gets missed, and I don't know if I should jump into the maps or not, is the idea of a woodland, so a standing patch of forest, and protecting that patch of forest, to me, is almost as important as protecting an agricultural field, because that affects wildlife, the visual aspects of it, there's all kinds of documentation about the benefits of trees, and is just as important. And I don't want us to lose that by just focusing on agriculture.
Doesn't Upper Macungie have an ordinance about trees or a certain size? You take out a tree, you got to plant so many other trees. And I read it once, but I know we don't have anything like that.
Alex
Currently.
Merler has offered me a couple of times to give me a draft on how he wrote the Upper Macungie ordinance. So he's really pushing to get that done here.
Yeah, I had an hour conversation with him Sunday on this.
Only-
Among other things, it was in the middle of the road, but anyway.
Yeah, that's one of those things that when we do have a development that's got mature, healthy trees, instead of clear cutting the whole lot, do we have an ability to work into these goals to maintain and work around them so that we don't lose those
Yeah, and
resources?
the way to if we incentivize the protection of the woodland by allowing them height, it's just an example, allowing them to go to 50 feet or some
They
other
need different
incentive.
setbacks if they're going to.
Right, or reserve, no setbacks on the different side, or
Or if they need to be-
averaging or something. There's a
they
lot
need
of,
to be closer to the road to preserve the trees behind.
yes,
So it can't be like, your front yard setback. It could be a woodland setback, something similar like that.
right,
Well, couldn't the trees also be open space? Instead
Right.
of
yes,
putting taller buildings, then use that section if there was, plot of land where there were several trees growing, that would be potentially considered open space that we would ask to be preserved.
yes. And there's different scales of, like we talked about, the lot development or the farm, giant parcel development. The other thing that Kate was in these goals and objectives was reactivate the Environmental Advisory Committee. Council. And
I've
we
been on
looked
it
at,
14 years.
you've been on it 14 years? How many times have you met in that 14 years?
Talk occasionally, but never officially.
It is in our township ordinance. So there are specific guidelines and tasks associated with it that are in the ordinance. So it's codified, which we looked at this afternoon, and 3 or 4 of the boards are in there, but that's it. So I don't know, I suppose that's a good thing that it's in the ordinance and it's very clear as to what the responsibilities are for that. So it's something worth considering. And another piece of this, we have a workshop tomorrow on preservation. with the BOC is there may be opportunities or things that we should act on quicker than waiting for the comp plan. So if there's things that come up and become a priority to move forward with, we should absolutely move forward with them. One of those was the Parks Rec and Trails plan. There was funding available, so we had to strike while the iron was hot, so to speak. So there's opportunities and things that we should move forward with, and if it's a recommendation, and it's a BOC decision on how to do that, but it's something worth considering on timing. As much as my role is here is the comp plan, and I want everything to tie into the comp plan and wait for the comp plan, but I know sometimes we can't wait and it doesn't make sense to wait. So that's another thing to kind of think about. If as we're going through this, if there's things that bubble up to the top that we should act on that right away, we can certainly move forward with things.
Dave, going back to the Environmental Advisory Council, and you mentioned other boards are in our ordinance as well. I've often wondered if it would make sense to combine the Landscape and Shade Tree Committee with the Environmental Advisory Council, because actually it's natural resources also, but I didn't know if the ordinance speaks to specifically landscape.
Shade Tree on that list? Shade Tree was in it. Shade Tree's a little...
Shade Tree is very specialized.
It is very specific,
And
because
it's got, and Dave Wilson can speak to that. It's got a specific mission. It's got a specific set of concepts that it works off of. I think it works very well as it stood alone.
Okay.
I view EAC and Shade Tree as two
Separate.
fairly different missions.
Okay.
Yeah, shade tree is pretty specific to just the trees and the right of way, so it's somewhat limited, where environmental advisory might have a larger scope.
I think a good analogy is the Environmental Advisory Committee would be looking at the forest, and the Shade Tree would be looking at the individual trees.
Exactly. And although Shade Tree does review land development plans, a big chunk of its work is actually just shade tree permits, going out into neighborhoods. Somebody wants to take down a tree, does it make sense to replace it? Which is, like I said, it's a different mission.
So the EAC would be looking at potentially a large development.
Oh yeah, they should look at every land development plan that comes through.
And
They should.
I would just add that we're seeing EACs and other municipalities are really taking on climate change and resiliency. And I think something just in our review of the future LV plan specifically, there's quite a bit of language around how that fits into a regional vision. And so not to say that's the direction or the focus area that has to be taken, but it is an opportunity to maybe expand in that area if it's of interest in the comp plan process.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
With regard to climate and resiliency, it was in one of the lists. One of the things that we talked about early on is in the structure of the comprehensive plan is having call outs on within a specific topic area, have a statement that talks about climate and resiliency, whether it's utility or woodlands or whatever topic, energy conservation, renewable energy, all of these things can be, highlights that are included in the plan as kind of an undercurrent throughout the whole thing, because sustainability, climate resiliency, climate change, it's more than just one topic. So they do marry well with a comprehensive plan, and they will inevitably be an undercurrent throughout it. It's good planning.
You have talked about the different resources, and they all seem to, I won't say they're all the same, but there's a thing with the inventory of them, and there's going to be economics with them. There's going to be making it easy, and then making it flexible with reuse rules and zoning. Do you have enough to put that all to those things together into an outline or a plan? And I think what would be useful is success stories elsewhere, if there's examples that we could say this has been done, and the close ones that were pointed out, like Rodale or, the Poconos, or, just so we can have that. Do you have enough to go now with resources?
So yes, I think we've kind of, in the discussions, it's will absolutely help us kind of weed through all of this and come back with a clearer presentation of these goals, implementation, and strategies. The idea of using examples is something where, with the structure of the comprehensive plan, kind of the vision we have in putting it together is it's a very graphical plan. Most people don't sit down and read a comprehensive plan like the old one. So the idea of, and this is something that, I learned during my time at LVPC, is you got to have digestible concepts and digestible goals and things that hit quick. So call outs on examples that work, or if we come across a municipality in Maryland that's using TDR that works, we can put it in that sidebar that highlights that. So I think using examples is a great idea.
Okay, so would that be like, say, next month we'd have like the environmental, I'm sorry, the resources would be kind of like what you did with the general things this month, and then we go on to
Yes. So next month,
community utilities.
Next month, we will present a refined resource protection, I'll just call it a package of goals and implementation, and kind of go over it like we did for the opening goals and objectives, and then we'll jump into utilities.
Okay, so and then we could proceed down.
And then we'll start
down the list.
Yeah,
That way, does that make sense?
Resource protection was the monster.
Yeah.
There were so many in there, and it was a tough one. The next few are not as intensive, I don't think, with number of goals. So I think we can start breezing through a lot quicker on the next few. But yeah, these two were definitely the most challenging.
Okay, good. All right, does that accomplish what you wanted to for this meeting then? At least to some extent?
Yes. Yes. It definitely became apparent how valuable the conversation and the discussion prior to us putting everything together was, having those two examples. So it definitely, we need that conversation, and we've had it tonight. We have two people taking notes. So we definitely have enough information to kind of go through and present a better package for the resource protection.
Anybody else have anything they want to add? Nothing in the chat?
I just had one comment I wanted to make about using examples. You mentioned Maryland. I think in our last plan, or maybe it was the overlays, some of the examples that were used really weren't comparable to the community that we live in, and the specific attributes of South Whitehall and what makes it attractive for people to be here. And I might ask if we do put examples in there to try to find a more common fit to South Whitehall that is more identifiable to our community when they look to that they could actually embrace it, as opposed to feeling like, well, that's not here, that's you know, more.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of examples out there. It's a big country, it's a big world. So we'll definitely find things that are appropriate. And I think the concept that we talked about in the beginning, where we have defining character areas, some things will be appropriate for one area, but not appropriate for another. And we will certainly tailor examples to the appropriateness for specific areas.
Thank you.
I just wanted to thank you for bringing up the concept of reexamining the comp plan and not just shelving it. It's done, it's shelved for 10 years. Because my concern is just implementing a strategy or a safeguard to make sure that the goals that we set are being met. And you touched on reexamining, and I appreciate that. And the other thing about agriculture, you know, we just made it through a pandemic. COVID is definitely a game changer in all of this, but there's also a war going on, and we're still in uncertain times. So I think it's very good to highlight and focus on ag. So thank you.
Good. Thank you, Monica. Anything else? Motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
All in favor, say aye.
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 Okay.
Thank you all
We're
for
done. Thank
helping
you.
with the meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you all.